The frozen lake. I've lived in Alaska for most of my life, born and raised near Nome, surrounded by vast wilderness, thick forests, and endless icy waters. Fishing on frozen lakes during winter was a tradition, something I did every year with my buddies. I knew the ice, the terrain, and the weather like the back of my hand. But one trip, one February afternoon, changed everything. The cold air was biting, colder than usual. It was the kind of cold where your breath hangs in the air like fog, and your skin burns with each inhale. Still, I wasn't going to miss out on a fishing trip to a remote lake near Nome. I invited Charlie and Greg, two of my closest friends. The journey was uneventful, with icy roads and untouched snow as we drove deep into the wilderness. When we finally arrived, the lake was eerily serene. The ice stretched for miles, smooth and undisturbed, reflecting the pale sun like a sheet of glass. The air was still, as if the world had paused. We set up camp near the lake's edge, drilled our ice holes, and prepared our gear. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. The silence was unnerving. It felt like we were the only people on Earth. As evening fell, the temperature dropped even further, and a thin fog began creeping over the ice. It wasn't unusual, just the typical mist that rises from frozen lakes at night, but it thickened the air, making it feel heavy. We fished in silence for hours. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, a primal unease that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It was as if the lake itself was watching us. Around midnight, we took a break and built a fire near our camp. The fog was so thick now that we could barely make out each other's faces. Charlie, always the superstitious one, spoke up. "You guys ever heard of the stories about this lake?" he asked, his voice low. We hadn't. "What do you mean?" Greg asked. "Some say the lake is cursed," Charlie whispered. "There's something beneath the ice that watches the fishermen who come here. Some folks have seen shadows moving under the surface, and others say they heard voices." I laughed it off. "Charlie, you've been watching too many horror movies." But Charlie didn't laugh. He stared at the mist rising off the lake, pale and serious. "I've heard stories from locals. They say you're not supposed to be here after dark." Greg rolled his eyes, but even I started feeling uneasy. The fog, the silence. It was starting to get to me. We decided to call it a night and pack up. That's when it happened. The ice beneath us cracked. At first, it was a low, distant rumble, like thunder with no clouds in the sky. Then it grew louder, the crack spreading across the ice as if something massive was shifting below. There was a scraping sound, like nails dragging on metal. Charlie went pale. "What the hell is that?" We froze, listening. Then we saw it. A shadow moving beneath the ice. It was huge, serpentine, and moving with unnatural speed. The shadow coiled and twisted, heading straight for our camp. We ran. Greg screamed, "Get to the truck now!" We didn't hesitate. We bolted toward the truck, but I glanced back once. What I saw still haunts me. The ice cracked in a circular pattern, and something massive began to rise. A dark, indistinct figure towered above the lake, like a living shadow breaking free from its frozen prison. We didn't stop running until we were back in the truck, the engine roaring as we sped away. The mist thickened behind us, and the lake fell silent again, as if nothing had happened. The next day I returned with a team of searchers, but there was no sign of anything strange, just the same cold, lifeless ice. I don't know what we saw that night, or what was beneath that lake, but I do know one thing. I'll never go ice fishing there again. Some things, once seen, should remain buried beneath the frozen surface. Story 2. The Shadow in the Northern Lights. Guiding people through the Alaskan wilderness has been my life's work for over a decade. I've led people on all sorts of trips, hiking, fishing, kayaking, and most commonly, aurora tours. There's something magical about watching the northern lights dance across the sky. It's a moment of connection with nature that's hard to describe, something that leaves even the most jaded traveler speechless. One winter, I had a group of 4, 2 couples from the lower 48, who had signed up for my Northern Lights tour. They were all eager for the experience of a lifetime, and I promised them we'd get as far out as possible, away from the light pollution of Fairbanks, for the best possible view. We set out in the late afternoon, heading into the backcountry, where the trees grew dense and the snow-covered trails stretched endlessly through the woods. The deeper we went, the more isolated we became. The sky that evening was clear, with just a touch of clouds on the horizon. It was cold, colder than usual, but it didn't bother me. I had dressed appropriately. The group was bundled up in heavy coats and scarves, excited but also anxious about the night ahead. When we reached our spot, a remote clearing in the woods near the edge of a frozen lake, I set up the campfire and began preparing the group for the auroras. I talked about the science behind the lights, how they were formed, the solar winds and charged particles interacting with the Earth's atmosphere. But the real magic came when we saw the first streak of green cut through the sky. We all fell silent, mesmerized by the spectacle overhead, the vibrant, swirling patterns of greens, purples, and reds dancing across the sky. It felt almost like we were on another planet, far away from the world we knew. The air was thick with awe. And then it happened. I noticed a shape in the corner of my eye, something tall and dark, moving at the edge of the light display. I thought it was a trick of the light at first, maybe a shadow cast by the trees. But as I focused, it didn't move like any shadow I'd ever seen. It was too deliberate. The group was silent, too absorbed in the beauty of the auroras to notice at first. But then one of the women, Rebecca, pointed and gasped. "What is that?" I followed her gaze, and there it was again. This dark, shifting figure, standing just beyond the trees. It wasn't a person, not in the traditional sense. It was tall, taller than any human should be. Its outline a blur, blending in with the dark backdrop of the forest. I saw no face, no features, just an inky blackness against the brilliant colors of the auroras. I tried to explain it away, telling myself it was a trick of the light or my eyes adjusting to the darkness. But the longer I stared, the more I became convinced that something was out there. The shape moved slightly, and it was almost like it was gliding through the air, not walking like a human or an animal. It seemed to be floating just above the snow, its movements fluid, unnatural. Suddenly, a sharp cry rang out from the group. "Mark, look!" I turned, and there was John, one of the men from the group, pointing frantically toward the figure. "It's coming closer!" I snapped into action, trying to calm everyone down. I told them to stay by the fire, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shape. I felt my heartbeat quicken as the figure moved closer, just beyond the tree line, its presence growing more and more imposing. And then it stopped. It wasn't just standing still, it was hovering, almost as if it were watching us. A thick, oppressive silence settled over the clearing, and even the auroras seemed to dim slightly, like the lights themselves were intimidated by whatever was out there. "Mark, we need to leave. This isn't right," said Rebecca, her voice trembling. I nodded, my own fear creeping up. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to the isolation and the odd things the wilderness sometimes plays on the mind. But deep inside, I knew we weren't alone. I ordered the group to pack up quickly, though it took longer than it should have. When we finally turned to leave, the shape, whatever it was, seemed to follow us, staying just beyond the tree line, its presence like a shadow at the edge of our vision. We hurried back to the van, my heart hard racing the entire time. But the fear didn't end there. On the drive back to Fairbanks, we talked little. There was too much tension, too many questions with no answers. When we reached the city, I thought the whole experience would fade, that we would brush it off as a bad, scary moment. But something was different. The fear lingered. Rebecca was especially affected. She kept talking about the eyes she thought she saw in the darkness. Eyes that were black and empty, staring at her from the shadows. When I asked her to elaborate, she said she could still feel those eyes on her, even after we left. She hadn't slept the whole night. But it wasn't just Rebecca. A few days later, I started hearing strange stories about other people who had been in the area that night. People who hadn't been on our tour, but who had been camping nearby. They spoke of seeing a dark figure moving in the auroras, of hearing whispers in the wind, and of feeling watched. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. Was it some sort of supernatural entity? A strange animal we couldn't identify? Or was it something else, something unexplainable? In the vast wilderness of Alaska, whatever it was, I know one thing for sure. I've never seen the Northern Lights the same way again. Story 3. The Silent Town. It's funny how quickly the wilderness can make you forget everything. The city, the noise, the people. All of it fades away when you're surrounded by the vastness of Alaska. I had been photographing the rugged landscapes for years, capturing the stark beauty of the northern wilderness, but nothing had prepared me for the eerie encounter I would have one cold winter day in a place I had never even heard of, a town called Cold Water. I was heading back to Anchorage after a successful shoot in the Denali area, and I had some extra time on my hands. That's when I decided to explore a little side trip. I had heard from a fellow photographer about an old, forgotten town in the interior of Alaska, a place so remote it didn't even show up on most maps. Cold Water. I'd seen the name mentioned once, tucked away in some obscure reference in a travel blog, and curiosity got the best of me. The road to Cold Water was narrow, barely a path carved out in the snow and trees. It was the middle of winter, and the snow had begun to fall harder as I drove deeper into the unknown. The farther I went, the more isolated it became. The trees were thick and close, their branches bending low under the weight of the snow. I couldn't help but feel like the world around me was becoming more suffocating, the air heavier. By the time I reached the town, the sun had already set, leaving only the pale blue glow of the snow under the moonlight. Cold Water appeared before me, as if it had been plucked out of time. It was a ghost town, seemingly abandoned. There were no lights, no signs of life, just the haunting silhouette of decaying buildings, half covered in snow. The streets were eerily quiet, as if the town had been frozen in time. No sounds, no movement, just the soft whisper of the wind between the buildings. I parked my truck near the center of town. The old wooden structures towered above me like silent sentinels. The first building I noticed was a diner. Its windows were dark, but with the faintest glow from inside. As I approached the door, I felt a strange sense of foreboding, but I brushed it off. I had a job to do, and I was determined to get the perfect shot. The door creaked as I opened it, and the dim interior of the diner greeted me. The tables were all set, dishes still on the counters, untouched and unmoved. The cash register sat open, with a few crumpled bills lying on the counter. It looked as if someone had just walked out in the middle of serving lunch, leaving everything behind. I was taken aback. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave a fully functional diner like this? I took out my camera and began to take pictures of the eerie, abandoned scene, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. As I moved further into the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a strange sensation, like invisible eyes were on me, though there was no one else in the room. Suddenly I heard a noise, footsteps. It was faint, coming from somewhere above, as if someone was walking around on the second floor. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't seen any signs of life when I arrived. It was impossible for anyone to be here, yet the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, growing louder. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. But there was no reply, just the echo of my own words. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't seen any signs of life when I arrived. It was impossible for anyone to be here, yet the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, growing louder. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. But there was no reply, just the echo of my own words. I stepped cautiously toward the stairs, the old wood creaking under my weight. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. At the top of the stairs, I found a hallway lined with old rooms. The first door I tried was locked, but the second opened easily. Inside, the room was covered in dust, and the bed was perfectly made, as though it had been left in the middle of someone's day. I stepped in, my camera in hand, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I saw it. A shape. A dark, shadowy figure standing in the far corner of the room. Its back turned toward me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and stood completely still. I didn't know if it was a trick of the light or if my mind was playing games on me, but the figure didn't move, didn't speak. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat. I called out again, but my voice felt small, insignificant in the presence of this thing. But as I got closer, the figure turned, and I saw its face, or rather, its lack of one. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just a smooth blank surface where a face should be. I froze, terror spreading through my body like ice. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in the air. the figure took one slow step toward me, its movements jerky, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. I turned and fled, crashing through the door and down the stairs, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back in my truck. I didn't even think to look behind me, but I felt the presence of something watching me as I drove out of cold water. The streets remained eerily quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. When I returned to Anchorage, I tried to forget about cold water, but the images of the figure, its blank, faceless stare, haunted me. I never went back to that town, nor did I ever tell anyone about what I had seen. But there's one thing I know for sure. Coldwater wasn't abandoned because of some economic collapse or a shift in the population. It was abandoned because whatever was there didn't want people around. A few months later, I tried to find Coldwater again to document it properly. But when I looked for it on a map, the town was gone. There was no mention of it anywhere, no history, no coordinates. It was as if it had never existed at all.